this monthly quote. "We didn't get along. Dad was always beating up on my little brothers. He overreacted out of meanness. He beat up on my mother. He beat up on my mother and my grandmother once at the same time. Maybe that's what started it, the divorce and all. Dad just wasn't straightening out. He was getting drunk too much, getting too rowdy." The oldest of 4 boys was not only responsible but intelligent as well, with an IQ in the 120s, and was being raised by his mother and grandmother, who were strict and knew his friends. The Heights was just that kind of neighborhood. Corll would even spend an Easter dinner with the Henleys, though Wayne did not want his younger brothers to get close to the man. Henley stated in his eventual written confession that on March 24, 1972, he went to Corll's apartment and told him he wanted in. They immediately hopped in the GTO and went cruising for boys. He told Conaway when interviewed a few years later that, quote, "At first I wondered what it was like to kill someone. Later, I became fascinated with how much stamina people have. I mean, you see people getting strangled on television and it looks easy. It's not. Sometimes it takes 2 people half an hour." Corll also owned a dreaded white Ford Econoline van, which the trio used as well to transport bodies in a special wooden box. He'd often be seen cruising the Heights with the van full of neighborhood kids, and several of the missing boys' last known whereabouts were in or around a white van. They encountered Wayne's longtime friend, 18-year-old Frank Aguirre. Wayne convinced him to come back to the Schuster Street apartment to party, under the impression that his friend would be sold into some kind of sexual slavery. He was baited with the handcuff game, when one of the trio would pretend they couldn't get out of a pair of cuffs. Once they unlocked themselves, they'd have their target try, then immediately strap them to Corll's torture board. 8 foot tall and 3 feet wide, with holes in each corner for ropes and handcuffs to be attached to. Once his friend was restrained, Henley begged Corll to call it off, but instead he found out that he would actually be earning $200 for each boy he brought to be raped, tortured, and murdered. His friend was strangled and they buried him at the beach at High Island. The Aguirre family had already buried his younger brother Ronnie. It was then, Henley claimed, that he found out that this was also the fate of his friend David Hilligeist, whom Wayne had helped try to find, along with his friend Maliwinkle. Frank Aguirre had been working hard to prepare for life as a fresh adult, and Henley tried to convince his friend Rhonda to move on because her fiancé clearly wasn't coming back. Frank was the only person Henley was ever paid to procure for Corll. All the rest of the boys were for free. Brooks wrote in a later confession that also at this address, Corll and Henley overpowered him when he entered, then he was restrained while Corll raped him repeatedly before letting him go, knowing he'd just escaped death. The Schuster address was also where Billy Rittinger, the only victim to be released alive, was raped and tortured then let go, with Brooks claiming that he saved him from Corll. Rittinger would later attend court with a paper bag over his head. On April 20th, 1972, Henley's 18-year-old friend Mark Scott went over to party. When Corll tried to secure him to the torture board, Mark fought for his life. He was able to grab a knife, swiping at Corll's shirt and cutting it. Wayne had to subdue his friend at gunpoint to be sexually tortured before he strangled him with a cord and buried his body at High Island the following day. Police removed Mark from the missing persons lists after hearing that his parents received a letter from him, claiming he had gone to Mexico for a few days. Just about 2 months later, 16-year-old Johnny Delhomme decided to go stay with his aunt after his stepfather suggested they go get haircuts. On May 21st, 1972, he went to his best friend's house, 17-year-old Billy Balch, and the pair had breakfast before walking to the store to buy a soda. Billy knew Dean Corll, as a few years before that he'd been given Corll candy to sell door to door. His parents quickly put a stop to that, telling him they didn't want their kid bothering the man at his business. Then they had been neighbors 4 years prior in 1968. After the candy factory closed, he had moved in across the street from a different school, Cooley Elementary on 16th Street. Corll had decorated here in a manner that would appeal to the neighborhood boys, who quickly began hanging out there at all hours. Billy also described playing a game where they'd handcuff a boy and pretend they couldn't get him unlocked. Once again, Billy's parents told him to leave that man alone. When Billy and Johnny left the Balch home to walk to the store 4 years later, there wasn't any concern until they didn't return that evening to go to the drive-in movies with Mrs. Balch and her younger children. They never arrived, and 3 days later, postcards stamped 70 miles away were delivered, describing how they'd gotten jobs instead of sodas and that they'd be back in a month. When police were informed of the development, they took the boys off of the missing persons list, not interested to find out that Wayne had strangled Billy and Johnny, and also shot Johnny in the head before they were buried in the boat stall. Billy's mom was contacting anyone she could think of and questioning everyone who called her with a supposed tip. She got the idea to contact Corll, who had moved from the street about 4 years earlier, by reaching out to the woman he had been dating on and off for about the same amount of time. She even let her 2 sons call him Daddy, and they had only stopped seeing each other when she tired of the trail of boys constantly following him. The woman supplied Mrs. Balch with his new number, and she called him to see if he knew where Billy was, mainly because he hung out with so many of the neighborhood kids. Corll assured her that he'd let her know if he heard anything, but instead, he'd murder Billy's younger brother, 15-year-old Michael Anthony Balch, 14 months later. Tony Balch, who had actually run away from home several times before Billy went missing, his mom called him a wanderer, left his home on July 19, 1973 to get a haircut, and was also strangled by Wayne Henley before he buried him at Lake Sam Rayburn, deep in East Texas. Corll's father had a cabin there, making it an easy choice for a third graveyard. The man next moved to the Westcott Towers apartments, and on July 20th, 1972, 17-year-old Stephen Sickman went missing after leaving a party and was last seen walking down 34th Street before midnight. He was bludgeoned and choked to death and buried in the boat stall, although his remains wouldn't be identified for nearly 40 years. A month later, 19-year-old Roy Ike Bunton disappeared, likely while hitchhiking to work at a Houston area mall. His remains would also remain unidentified until 2011, and neither of Corll's accomplices mentioned these victims. 6 weeks later, in early October 1972, 14-year-old Wally J. Cimino told his mother he was going to spend the night at 13-year-old Richard Hembry's house, and they both subsequently vanished. They were last seen together getting into a white van in front of a grocery store, and Wally called his mother but was cut off after shakily asking, "Mama?" Brooks would later say that the boys were raped and tortured before being murdered later that day. The following month, 19-year-old Richard Kepner went missing after leaving to call his fiancée at a payphone and never coming back. They buried him at High Island Beach. 17-year-old Joseph Lyles was Dean Corll's next victim and a neighbor of David Brooks. Corll was now living at the Princessa Apartments on Wirt Road, and Brooks and Corll both said they weren't there this time. Lyle's body was also taken to the beach, but his remains weren't discovered until 10 years after the others. Joseph's identity was finally confirmed in 2009 via DNA testing. Wayne Henley was actually trying to get into the United States Navy at the time and was really excited about the prospect of taking off. He was denied because he hadn't graduated from high school. It was February of 1973 then, and the pace of the trio's murders stalled into the summer. It was reported during that time Corll had a medical issue related to his testicles, and Henley was known to have been living outside of the Houston area for a time. He'd gone to try and start a new life in Mount Pleasant at his aunt's house, but soon enough, he came back after not being able to find work. In early June, a new frenzy commenced when 15-year-old Billy Ray Lawrence was dropped off on a corner by his dad and never seen again. He did call that night and ask his father if he could go fishing with some friends at Lake Sam Rayburn. He told his dad he'd be back in 3 days. However, he was tortured for 3 days before being murdered and buried at the lake instead. A few days later, a letter arrived, postmarked Austin, Texas, that ended, "Daddy, I hope you know I love you. Your son, Billy." The letter claimed he'd gone to Austin for work and that he'd be back in August for school. A month later, Henley called and asked to speak to his friend, and Billy Lawrence's father repeated what the letter had read. 9 days later, on June 15, 1973, Raymond Blackburn, a 20-year-old new dad from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, went missing while hitchhiking home after coming to Houston to work construction. He was trying to get back to meet his newborn. Corll was now living 20 miles or so south of the Heights in the suburb of Pasadena, Texas, in his dad's old house, and as the summer of 1973 wore on, the trio were individually growing restless. In July of 1973, David Brooks, now 18, had married his pregnant girlfriend and moved about a half hour away from Corll's new residence. Corll and Henley would then commit 3 murders without him. On July 7th, Henley lured 15-year-old Homer Garcia to his death as he walked to get a haircut. It's no wonder these 70s teens refused to get them. The boys knew each other from having been classmates at a driving school in Bel Air, Texas. Homer was shot in the head and died in Corll's bathtub. Then he was buried at the lake. 5 days after Homer walked into oblivion, 17-year-old United States Marine Johnny Sellers went missing 2 days before his 18th birthday. There would later be controversy regarding whether he was really a victim of the trio. However, the assumption is that he was. He was the only victim buried fully clothed. 1 week after that is when 15-year-old Tony Balch disappeared, 14 months after his 17-year-old brother Billy had vanished, alongside his friend Johnny Delhomme, marking the 3rd Balch son in a row to fail to meet adulthood. The boy's oldest brother Marvin had died in a car crash in 1969. And just 6 days after Corll and Henley murdered Tony Balch, roommates Charles Cobble and Marty Ray Jones, aged 17 and 18, went missing, having last been seen on July 25, 1973. They were walking with Wayne Henley, and he ultimately took them to Corll's Lamar Street house in Pasadena, where the pair were sexually abused and tortured. Then, Corll handcuffed one ankle and one wrist of each boy to the same side of the torture board and told them to fight to the death. After a few hours, Marty was forced to watch as Charles was raped before he met a similar fate, only he was strangled by Henley with the cord from window blinds. He buried them in the boat shed after they'd been tortured for 2 days. Throughout that summer, 17-year-old Wayne Henley's friends noticed a change in his demeanor. He was edgy, nervous, and tense, babbling jumpily about how we had come to realize he had a drinking problem. The teen threw back beers all day long. David Brooks had shrunk back from his participation since he got married, and Henley even put in his written confession that Brooks wasn't there when he and Corll murdered Tony, Charles, and Marty. By early August, it seemed that Henley was looking for a way out himself. On an out-of-town fishing trip, he spoke wistfully of starting a new life in Australia, even offering to pay a friend's way for the company. Anything, it seemed, to get as far away from Houston as he could think to. On August 3rd, Corll raped and murdered 13-year-old James Stanton Dramala at the Lamar House in Pasadena.